Welcome to an introduction to green economics, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com. In this podcast, we are going to introduce a new way of looking at some more traditional subjects. Although we have called the course Green Economics, you will also find elements of accounting, sociology and biology. This first podcast introduces you to how we think about sustainability and how we might think about measurements that are related to sustainability. We start by asking the question, what is sustainability? Instead of writing out a definition, we ask you to consider how a number of features might be related to sustainability. We have assumed that for something to be sustained, it has to be recognized as an activity, and one in which humans take part if they so wish. Can such an activity be carried out over a period of time, which is what the root sustain would suggest? Can anything that is used in the activity be replaced? We ask this because if something cannot be replaced, then eventually the supply would be exhausted, and the activity could not be sustained. The next statements do not appear at first to be directly related to sustainability, but they have a place in our thinking. Will the activity cause damage? Is the activity affordable? Will the activity have an adverse effect on others? To look at sustainability requires us to look across boundaries. Activities involve resources, and those resources should be renewable and should be obtained without permanent damage to the environment. However, if we picture sustainability as being related to human activity, then we should also be looking at what we mean by sustainability for human activities. This brings in a number of social issues. Here we have named only three: housing or providing shelter to humans, providing education, and providing a level of health care are all activities that we might see as needing to be sustained. There may be other activities that you would put on your own list. Economics is usually seen in terms of supply and demand for goods and services. Our idea of sustainability brings in renewable resources and also the need to recycle. But we also see the activity as needing to give a return on investment and to provide funding for further research and development. We also place emphasis on supplies being affordable and able to meet demand. The boundaries are seen to overlap, and where there is overlap, these represent areas where there is a need for further discussion. Environmental and economic viewpoints may well differ initially on whether the approach should be to move towards sustainability by the use of subsidies or incentives or through legislation. The environmental and social overlap will raise questions about the use of resources, such as use of land for leisure, and whether conservation and preservation will be needed to ensure sustainability. Social and economic issues will likely clash as we consider the issues of fair trade, of use of cheap labour, and other ethical issues. Whether it is possible for all three areas to merge will determine whether sustainability becomes a reality or remains nothing more than an ideal or a dream. A starting point for anyone looking at green issues is to determine what is meant by renewable. If we have no time limit on our definition, then even a fossil fuel could be considered renewable, though it would also involve a few climatic changes and some continental movement to recreate conditions that have led to enormous coal measures being produced. Most of us agree that a resource should be renewable within an expected lifetime. How do we determine that lifetime? It takes a tree many years to grow, but a newspaper is only good for the day it is published. Sometimes it can be easier to determine the cycle. If wood is used for furniture, then the resource should be renewed within the lifetime of the furniture. A field of wheat is harvested within a year, so the use of wheat needs only to be within the year. If sugar cane is used to provide food, then the cycle is as for wheat. But what if it is used to produce ethanol for automobile fuel? Whilst the cane may be renewable, we also need to consider the other resources that are used to make the ethanol. This can mean the activity is not truly one where resources are renewable. So in the activity we need to think in terms of all resources being renewable. An activity should also cause no damage to the environment, which means maintaining soil structure and preventing erosion, as well as not contaminating the soil with pollutants or allowing herbicides, pesticides or fertilizer to enter watercourses. Does this mean we also have to consider whether irrigation causes damage if the water tables are falling? Most would agree the answer is in the affirmative. Destroying rainforests is clearly causing damage, but should we also be reclaiming land that can be used for agriculture and preventing further use of agricultural land for building? Defining sustainable in terms of social standards is not quite as easy. In this case, we have to consider what is considered to be essential or desirable to maintain a suitable standard of living. These will make different demands upon resources according to region, with the greatest demands for efficiency coming where the demands for energy usage are highest. Materials that can be recycled or renewed are important, and the lifetime of a dwelling will vary between regions. Should we include education standards? Access to education is surely something we all have a right to, and that does mean using resources. Currently, there are wide differences in terms of provision of clean drinking water and access to health care. What is the minimum, and what will be the resource demand? Most countries also have what are termed social welfare programs, and there could be some controversial issues here. At present, large numbers of people are left unemployed, but they still use resources. People themselves are a resource, and perhaps we need to think more deeply about how we use that resource. Traditional economics has often ignored green issues and placed a very high degree of importance on maximizing profit from an activity, ignoring whether a resource is renewable and considering only whether it is available. The need is still to ensure there is a return on investment of capital, and the need still remains to provide resources for research and development. If we did not have research and development, then we might still be moving overland on horseback. The pattern of growth over the last century has seen a large rise in the amount of economic activity that is now controlled by corporations, and green views would suggest a need to consider much greater diversity, including cooperatives that support the enterprise of individuals. Currently, the oversight of economic activity lies ultimately with government, whose interest in global cooperation is limited, as evidenced by attitudes towards emissions. With limited resources, since even renewable resources have a time factor before they are renewed, there is a need to consider what activities are desirable. Many current activities are a result of a demand that has been created through advertising and can hardly be said to be essential. The result has been a culture of people wanting items rather than needing items. Does this mean we now have to set out priorities for goods and services to be provided? The idea of recycling does not enter into the calculations of most activities until it becomes important to consider in terms of profit, or until the disposal of waste becomes a problem. To move towards sustainability requires that recycling of materials is essential, as is some consideration of what we do about materials that cannot be recycled easily. The approach so far has been a little abstract. What are we actually going to do? The most important step will be to undertake measurements that try and quantify our activities, to then be able to set out aims and objectives. Traditionally, economic activity has been measured in terms of currency, and comparisons have usually been made in terms of dollars. Whilst this is still important if we are to measure profitability, there are other measures. Energy demands for activities are increasingly being considered, partly because the cost of energy is rising, and now we have the technology to measure energy use with far greater accuracy. The history of measuring harmful emissions is only a little over 50 years old, but we can now measure these with far greater accuracy, and such measurements are part of trying to quantify activity in terms of a carbon footprint, or an environmental or ecological footprint. There are some measures that are less easy to quantify, and trying to measure preference is a technique that should not be ignored when looking at some of the social issues. A useful start can be made by looking at data collection and determining what information we have now, how reliable it is, and what is needed for the future. There is, surprisingly, quite a large amount of data in some areas, thanks to the work of charities and the United Nations. The next section is given to looking at data measurement. This table shows measurements for the emission of carbon dioxide for producing electricity by different means. The unit is clear: the number of grams of carbon dioxide produced for each kilowatt-hour of electricity generated. It has use because it compares 7 different methods of generating electricity, and also because it has comparisons between different countries. We can see that the orders of magnitude are similar for all the different countries. Coal generally emits over twice the amount of carbon dioxide when compared to gas, and both are much higher than solar or wind methods, which are considered to be renewables. The figures for nuclear energy are low, and you will see that the figures were produced by the nuclear industry. Whether these figures for nuclear power are really that low could be checked by looking at a survey provided by a source free from this bias. We should also note that any set of figures should really be dated, since advances in technology may have reduced emissions. In this case, the data is presented in the form of a pie chart, which has visual appeal. What about the information it presents? First, we see there is no real unit, other than volume. We do see comparative volumes, but nothing that indicates actual volumes, or how many people produce these volumes. This form of data is only limited use, and we try to quantify in a different way. Data of this nature are more useful because they give figures for estimated or average water usage and provide comparisons between different regions. They make the point that water usage is very high in areas like North America and Europe. They would be of even more use if there was some measure of available water from renewable sources, or how much water is being provided by lowering of a water table. In this case, the data presented is useful. It gives a clear indication of quantity, tries to give a breakdown of how the figure was arrived at, and also gives a comparison. The result is that we see that the mean for each person in the United States is around twice the mean for all other industrial nations. Expressing figures as a mean per person can be useful. It allows a more meaningful discussion than just presenting total emissions for, say, the USA, China and India, without consideration of the population involved. A measurement that is becoming more popular is to determine the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted to produce a kilogram of different foods. In general, we can see that under most circumstances the amount to produce meat or animal products is high compared to producing a plant product such as wheat. Some producers are adding information about the carbon footprint to their packaging, but without a general understanding of why this is important, it is unlikely that just presenting information will produce significant change. As we try and combine different types of information, then the data can become less accurate. This diagram shows an attempt to combine the effects of different activities and to translate them into the unit of area. The measurement has to be seen in the context of the red line, which represents the average biocapacity per person on a global scale. We can then see that the activities of 3 countries greatly exceed this average. This method of measuring an ecological footprint is likely to become more popular as data becomes more accurate. Whilst much space is given to the recycling of plastics, the data presented here show that recycling levels alone are insufficient to gain an understanding of what is currently taking place. The rise in the use of plastics must also be considered. Suppose, for example, the USA had recycled no plastic in 1980 and that it now recycled 50% of all plastic. What is the overall effect? Well, certainly better than if no plastic were recycled. But how about looking at it another way? The amount of plastic in kilograms that is now not being recycled has increased since 1980, simply due to the overall increase in usage of plastic. Looking at data in this way is an important part of green economics. The use of this bar chart lies in the units being presented. The information is presented as kilograms per person, which means we can consider the activities of individuals in different countries and make comparisons. What is the measurement that you would consider to be most useful? To me, it is the gap, measured in kilograms, between quantity generated and quantity recycled, since that gap or difference represents wastage. What happens to this amount? The purpose of including this chart is to highlight differences between countries when we consider access to tertiary education. Presenting the data in this way can have disadvantages, since it tells us nothing about the standards being attained by individuals in each country. We will say more about measuring or assessing poverty in future podcasts, but this chart gives one way of looking at poverty. Note that it is measured and presented in terms of currency. The green approach is to look at activities rather than currency. How many of these have access to clean drinking water, sanitation, shelter, adequate food, education, healthcare, and a whole host of other activities? We have talked about activity and measurement. This is a short exercise to see if you can now try and look at activity in a new way. Try and see how many activities you can identify that are involved in buying and wearing a t-shirt, and how you think you might measure these. The traditional approach would be to use a unit of currency, the dollar, euro or sterling, and to cost out raw materials, labour and overheads in production, leaving just a purchase price for the final consumer. This is how economics and accounting have viewed the process of production and manufacture in the past. Our new approach looks at activities. When the cotton is grown, there are measurements we are interested in. Seed is grown. The crop may need irrigation, use of fertilizers and pesticides, and labour is required to tend and harvest the crop. When making the t-shirt, there will be the cost of raw materials, which may include bleachers and dyes in addition to the cotton, as well as labour and factory overheads. There is also a cost in getting the product to the retailer. The retailer has few costs, the costs for the t-shirt and overheads. For the consumer, the cost does not stop with purchase. Further costs are incurred with washing the t-shirt, using water, detergent and electricity, maybe a fabric conditioner as well. Then there is the question of what happens to the t-shirt, which may be recycled, have a further use, or just go to landfill. With cost accounting, all is measured with currency as a unit. With environmental accounting and economics, we can look at measuring energy consumption with a unit of kilowatt hours, and we might be more selective and try and identify carbon dioxide emissions for each activity. Finally, we might want to look at the use of renewable and non-renewable materials for each activity. You will now be aware that to look at issues of green accounting and green economics, we have to place a greater emphasis on the consequences of activity rather than profit. In doing this, we need to have suitable measures to measure the impact of the activities we undertake. and this requires more than simply giving everything a monetary value. This ends this podcast to introduce green economics, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com.